Good morning. You're in like cartoon land. Fantastic. Oh, are you on mute? I think you're mute, Tom.
I was on mute. I should be good now.
Yeah.
Got to keep backgrounds changing. Teaching. You had to keep people interested.
What are you teaching?
I teach in a master's in branding program at the School of Visual Arts in New York.
Oh,
So
cool.
I teach a class. I'm a psychologist. I teach a class in the psychology of branding, and then now at this point in the program, we're doing thesis. So we're finishing up our thesis first time ever online. So it's been really challenging.
Yeah. Oh man, I would love to talk to you more about your. I'm glad I asked you what you teach. I'd love to find out more about that. It's super interesting. I've been yeah, sort of became fascinated with branding as a practice. My last couple of years when I was at Nokia, where I was asked to help out with the branding of the program that we're working on in the studio. And my background's engineering, so I was just kind of like, what?
Right,
Uh,
right, right.
and also, I could be naively, because I didn't know much about it. Like I was just sort of dismissive about branding. Like,
So
what do
so
you?
many so many people are.
Yeah, the product works. So what else is there to do?
Yeah, right, 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 right. Well,
uh, but
our program is 10 years old, and we're really it's been very successful. We get students from all over the world that come to New York. Well, we used to get students from all over the world who came to New York. So it's been a great experience. I was part of the founding faculty, and been terrific.
Yeah, it'd be great. Maybe we can have like just a I don't know, just find time to have a chat to learn more about each other and the work
That
that you're doing.
might
Super
be great.
interesting. Yeah, cool. How's everyone doing? Maintaining? I'm gonna have to run inside. I left my glasses inside. Carry on amongst yourselves. Sorry, I'll be right back. I just realized I haven't been using them all morning. I wonder if I actually need them. Funny. Let me try. No, I can't see you. Cool. How was the week? Anything interesting happen? No.
Well, the Twitter thing was interesting. Just the realization that a company masquerading as a platform and as a system is vulnerable to the most incredible sort of exploits in a way that nothing that wouldn't be able to happen to a road system or the U.S. postal system or the telephone network, and yet some of the most powerful and important people in the world were all hit by just an incredibly squalid scam. That was quite a thing for me, not just because it was embarrassing, but because it really laid bare what it is and what it isn't.
Yeah, that's a really good one. It's sort of I've been paying attention to it just like kind of in the periphery of my vision, but it's when I remember when I did one evening just sort of catching up on the news, and just basically read the headlines and just the early analysis. Yeah, a couple things occurred to me. One was I guess to your sentiment, like what a profoundly delicate system that everyone's effectively everyone's plugged into, and we already know like the secondary tertiary kind of implications of what can happen when something gets said or spread or disseminated in Twitter, or any of the other networks, but let's talk about Twitter for the moment. But the other thing that occurred to me was a conversation I had with a friend who used to work there, doesn't work there anymore, but it's like very highly placed individual, and we were just kind of catching up, and I was talking some more about the design fiction work, which this person was super familiar with. It wasn't new to them, and they sort of said it didn't mean to be like a dismissive thing, but it was a sort of offhanded things like, well, we don't do this kind of stuff at Twitter. And I remember saying, yeah, no, I can totally understand that. But at the same time, I've been thinking actually quite regularly, it's like, maybe that's part of the problem, that you don't kind of, run through possible scenarios. It's all, I get how an organization like Twitter works, or companies like it, it's like, it's all based on the here and now. Like, what can we do now to enhance the experience of our system, whatever the things that they do, like new products, they refer to them, that support different kinds of interaction and user experiences and advertising and all this kind of stuff. But they never, I mean, shouldn't say it as a blanket statement, but let's assume that they don't really kind of run through possible alternative futures at almost any level that don't have anything to do with operations in the most plain sense of it. So it's kind of interesting, like, it would be an interesting design fiction, and almost certainly one that would come up. I would guess, if you had like a good, engaged, kind of like constructively, creatively contrarian group of people to say, okay, let's see what a future looks like with Twitter in these under these 3 or 4 possible circumstances.
But it was an inside job, though. This was an inside job by Twitter employees who were part of the hack.
I don't know. It's a good question. If anyone knows,
it's already, well. This is the vector that's currently most possible. Highest probability is that this was an inside job of changing phone numbers by Twitter employees of blue check accounts, and the tokens get retained, so people don't see across the other apps. It's a complicated technical thing, but that's the latest hypothesis, that it's an inside job.
I'm not sure if it's an entirely inside job. My understanding is that there are very powerful administrative controls that staff at Twitter have, and that somebody managed to do social engineering, basic confidence tricksterism, to gain access to those administration controls from outside the company. So somebody who potentially was part of it, but somebody who knew about the fact that these tools exist, was able to gain control of them and make use of them in the same way that it was quite surprising that I'm not sure what the employee was doing, but there was somebody who was able to disable Donald Trump's account on their last day, and it was disabled for several hours before anybody realized that the person who, for better or worse, is the leader of the free world, was unable to use their favorite platform because of a single disgruntled employee having access to just a checkbox. Disable this account? Yes. So, and similar to the fact that there was a Saudi national operative who was, I believe, was feeding people information about various sort of anti-Saudi accounts, simply by virtue of the fact that the way in which access is sort of meted out is not something that is considered to be of substantial importance or interest, and accesses aren't logged in the same way that they really should be by people who would believe that this is an important thing. To your point, Julian.
I'm sort of interested in the context of how we might imagine that the kind of approaches and ways of thinking that we sort of discuss here might operate in a context like at a place like Twitter or whatever, where it would potentially, I don't know, I guess like in a productive way, like mitigate these kinds of things from happening, or at least like generating, in a almost thinking like in a very pragmatic sense. Oftentimes I think about design fiction in a kind of like near-term strategy, but if we think about it in the context of like, I don't know a better word than like operations, like if we want to kind of explore potential risks, both in a kind of instrumental sense, like things that we're describing, like potentially should we be running kinds of design fiction exercises that allow us to identify things of this sort that might happen, or even to run them through to the degree where it's like, you know, if you're at a particular, you have a particular responsibility within the company, it's like you have to go through these kind of exercises, and, or maybe you even just get, unexpected fire drills, you know, where you kind of do what a social engineer might do. What was it? Confident? You used a great little turn of phrase, confidence, something.
Just confidence tricksterism, being a con man, somebody who is
Yeah.
able to sort of say, I'm doing routine maintenance on your password.
Yeah.
So I'll need that for fixing things.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting for me to think about, you know, other ways in which kind of the approaches that we think about, or maybe, you know, I guess it's a question to everyone, like, is it even, is it an entirely different thing? Is it not design fiction? Sorry.
I might jump in. First off, hi, I'm Kevin, and I haven't been here, so I don't really know what the norms are, and I don't want to break them. This is a very interesting conversation to me because I actually run AI policy at a little company called Facebook, which I joined a year ago after about 20 years in civil society, working on issues of privacy and free speech and things like that at organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation and such. So basically, I you know, and I basically said this publicly, I went to Facebook to try and help ensure that they didn't make some of the same mistakes on AI that they made on privacy. And one of the positive things that's happening internally that I can't really talk a lot about, but I can say we do have a growing responsible innovation team that has been developing you know, formats and processes for strategic foresight thinking to sort of brainstorm negative externalities that we otherwise wouldn't think of, like try and imagine the worst things that could happen. And design fiction hasn't been a part of that yet, but as a science fiction and design fiction nerd, I am certainly advocating for that. I just don't personally have the budget for it myself. So, there's definitely a feeling throughout a number of the companies about that previous thinking and testing about the future has been primarily focused on the user and primarily focused on the positive, when actually we need to think a lot more about people other than the user and the impacts on them, and a lot more about potential negative things. One security researcher named Ashkan Soltani puts it, I thought, in a clever way. We often talk about usability testing, and we need to start thinking a lot more about abusability testing, and thinking about how the tools could be misused by bad actors. But anyway, that's sort of my way of introducing myself to the group and saying hello, and I'm glad to be here.
Well,
And I have questions for the Ask Me Anything when we get to questions. But
Morning, thanks, Kevin. You haven't violated any norms.
Great.
We're just a bunch of people gathered in a room, basically, having either coffee or drinks, depending on what time zone, I suppose. Bradley, are you going to say something?
I was going to say that's a really great mission, and I'm really excited to hear that Facebook is picking that up. I've spoken to some data scientists from sort of ex-Google, now Facebook, who have been saying that there is a lot about the way that they imagine what can happen with their platform that has been pretty dull-headed in the past. And so having an awareness from a public policy perspective of what are social norms within some other places like government or academic sectors in terms of things like personally identifiable information, and how disclosure of data is something that also needs to be sort of collected and measured and stuff like that is really useful. I think you're right. Like, I think design fiction is a really valuable tool, and I think sort of scenario planning or imagining sort of situations unfolding, but through the lens of how they're being how they're happening on specific platforms is really interesting. You know, one of the things that I really liked, again, you know, it was sort of a positive story, but there's a Thai myth, I think Ramayana, that Google sort of pretended was happening over all of its different sort of systems back in sort of 2006, 2007, sort of showing things in Google Calendar and maps and stuff like that. But just imagining other darker scenarios, either things that have happened in the past, but imagining them happening through and over one's own platforms would be very, very useful, I think. As as well as other potential future ones, and how exactly individual sort of products that exist within one's domain could be sort of involved or implicated, I guess, in things would be really useful. I mean, I don't think anybody would have realized that there was a very real sense in which public policy was being dictated through Twitter 4 years ago. But here we are. So, you know, something happening through Oculus, or something happening through. I mean, things that do happen through Facebook Rooms these days are very significant. And somebody from within the company would probably know a lot more about that. So yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah, I find the topic absolutely fascinating. It's especially, you know, in these contexts where, and I guess it's mostly in reflection, like, you know, and it's that one conversation with, you know, his very dear friend, who from Twitter, who, as I mentioned, is no longer there, but the idea of, it's almost a question like, why wouldn't you just sort of do these explorations to understand where might this platform go? I know you have the, you know, there's, one would have the kind of aspirational vision, but it's usually along a particular vector, and that vector is getting from, you know, 100 users to 1 million users, or getting from no revenue to break even to, like, you know, massive revenue or market share. It's never like, how is this going to change the way in which people as social beings live in the world? Except, you know, I guess I should caveat that there was one, you guys remember a couple of weeks ago, we had that presentation, and it was just like a little note, a little part of like one of the slides where I think I'm forgetting his name, Stephen, brought up the Richard Brautigan poem, which I've just gone on deep dives. It's gone like totally into this other world. Alongside of it, all watched over by machines of loving grace, and realizing that that sort of embodied, I think, some of the sentiment of I'm hypothesizing a lot here, the sentiment of a lot of what Silicon Valley, at least the version that we're kind of living with, you know, the .com 1.0 is living with. It's like, well, if we just have like algorithms to help us connect and communicate, like, things will be better, won't they? If we just have a platform where anyone can share their ideas, things will be better, wouldn't they? If we're just able to make you know, connections with the people and places and things that matter most, the world will be better, wouldn't it? And that vision is like so embedded in that poem. I've just been kind of lost in imagining like where things went wrong and how they could be better, whatever the next time, or how we kind of do better now. And it's literally been a conversation of like, you know, I deeply believe in you know, an aspect of that vision. At the same time, I'm always constantly aware of the more, you know, the deleterious side of it. And I think that's just having awareness of like the fallibility of humanity, of humans, of individuals, and how can you kind of undo that? And I think design fiction is potentially a way to understand more completely the implications of you know, a world where we're just living by the whims and vagaries of an algorithm. So I'm not saying
on the theme.
Sorry, go on, Kevin. Go on.
Sorry, I was just going to say, on the theme of sort of that vision of machines of loving grace, I highly recommend a book that actually really transformed the way I think about this stuff, called From Counterculture to Cyberculture by Fred Turner at Stanford, which really drew a direct line from the sort of like ultimately white male-led, like libertarian counterculture that sort of wanted to both separate from technical society while enjoy its fruits, and viewed technology as sort of personal liberation tools, and how like that thinking, and really that cohort, like people like Stewart Brand and whatnot, went directly from that to the sort of wired cyber libertarianism of the 90s that kind of defined our vision for the internet for about 20 years, and led to us not thinking about like the negatives, or thinking about, frankly, historically underrepresented or marginalized communities. And I say that as someone who was a part of that community, working at places like Electronic Frontier Foundation, that were founded by some of the people who came out of the counterculture and had that view of the future of the internet. And it was a really great tool of self-reflection for me, about how we need to sort of reapproach our thinking about the internet at this point. Or at least, you know, are well past due needing to reapproach our thinking about the internet at this point. But that poem is sort of like, Yeah, that poem reduces what they were, their fantasy in a really, condensed way.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, that, essentially to a large degree, the Turner, obviously makes a much more complete argument than I did. And that's the essentially that's the arc, and just understanding that. And I guess so. In the context for us, the question is, with an awareness of this, and an understanding and appreciation of it, is it possible to have a better kind of technology is such a loose term, but like a better technocultural kind of sensibility or ethos, so that we can use the power of these, the power that is implied by the machine, in a way that, I don't know, what's the word? Better? Yes, that kind of revives a sense of humanity, that does essentially the opposite of what it's really well tuned to do presently, which is almost like isolate and alienate in a way, or something, that prompts, that doesn't encourage us to doom scroll. It doesn't encourage us to click on silly links and all those kinds of things. Where does that come from, and how do you do it so that you can have a sustaining culture, or even enterprise in the kind of business sense of things? What's Facebook plus Patagonia?
Well, Fred Skinner wrote about this and taught the world how to create behavioral controlling mechanisms, and it's what builds all those big buildings out in the middle of the desert in Las Vegas, right? So that the most powerful shaping mechanism of human behavior ever created is variable ratio positive reinforcement, and Fred Skinner showed us how to do that with rats and with people, and it continues to be the most effective methodology. It is amazing how we as a species are absolutely controlled by these kinds of mechanisms, and they're very difficult to resist.
Yeah, I think that the reward schedules stuff that Tom is mentioning is an incredibly important part of any kind of social design. Being aware that those things can crop up, and if you are paying attention to only superficial sort of metrics like time in app or number of videos watched, then you need to be incredibly diligent in making sure that you are understanding what kind of buttons are being pushed for people. There's a temptation to try to just collect more data, but just to try to figure out whether people are less satisfied for more time and things like that. But really just observing people and understanding what it is that the long run impact of consuming your system appears to be would go a long way, and people's willful blindness to the practical psychic impact or social impact of it. I don't I like the psychology, the technology. These are all tools in service of achieving a goal, but the goal has to be better and more thoughtful.
And even conscious awareness, I mean, conscious awareness can have, of course, an impact, but it's amazing how even conscious awareness can be defeated, if you will, by the mechanics of behavioral shaping. It's astonishing. Because none of us ever believes we're being manipulated because we're smart, right? And we know what's going on, right? But it is incredible how little intervention conscious awareness can the impact that conscious awareness can have on behavior. Because like Kahneman talks about in System 1, the elephant is always perceiving the world and making decisions about things that are way below the level of awareness.
I'm intrigued by what Julian said about what a Facebook crossed with a Patagonia would look like, and mainly from the Patagonia end. Because I'm wondering about, I'm thinking about, you know, an attempt to do something Facebook shaped exists in a world that is incredibly susceptible to all of those network effects. So Patagonia is interesting from an ethical and social impact point of view. But if you look at its go-to-market, you know, you can start a small retail business. You can design physical products and then put them out into the world. I'm really intrigued by thinking hard about what environment would you need for a Patagonia-style Facebook to be successful or to be able to thrive over the course of about 10 to 15 years? Because we can't really compare, you know, Facebook as it is now to a Facebook Patagonia style that we would want to start now or that we could imagine seeing now. I feel like that's not really a, you know, that's not really a world that we live in right now, but what kind of starting conditions might you need? And then how could you extrapolate out from that?
Yeah, it's a good one. I actually, I was just, I mean, I've been thinking about this quite directly, but I'm not at all disagreeing with where you're starting. Then I also wonder if now is the starting condition where the kind of reflection that people have on the basis of, you know, everything that's going on from, you know, combined with like an awareness, people are like, you know what, like I don't like this anymore, as opposed to a fresh starting condition where you kind of start with a blank slate. So this, you know, is this the moment of a, you know, lowercase r revolution, where it's just this kind of level, a level of like awareness and kind of like intense desire or need at some level where it's like you close that gap between whatever motivates people to get on Facebook. I don't mean that dismissively, but practically,
Yeah.
they're like, oh, you know, it's a great way for me to stay in touch with my college friends or with my family. Like that's a good positive thing. Can you do that in such a way where it's like, and I like the values of the folks who put this system together, in the same way that, you know, you might make a decision about whether you're gonna get, you know, a puffer jacket from TJ Maxx that you're not really sure where it came from or who was exploited when it was made, versus, you know what, I'll spend twice as much, get it from Patagonia, know that it'll last forever. If it gets a tear, I can send it back to them and they'll fix it for nothing. And that guy Yvonne, he seems so cool. He seems like very avuncular. Seems like the kind of guy I could have over for a barbecue, where it's like, I don't know, who is what hedge fund owns the other chain store? I have no idea. Don't like it.
So I had quite a few chats with Tom Coates about Planetary, about the stuff that he had been doing with Rabble, on a kind of a distributed ledger based social network with roughly, I think, the same kind of principles. And one thing that I felt strongly about when I was talking about it with him was launching or trying to meet the needs of a specific community first. And that one of the things that I feel people get sidetracked with about Facebook is this kind of, Facebook is useful right now because it's the easiest way for me to get in touch with the largest number of people. And I don't really feel that you can compete against that. But if you're looking for a lowercase r revolution, then, you know, I would always bring up the example of how Discord, for example, is doing incredibly well in video game communities, and looking at the specific social networks or the specific products that do Facebook-like things. Or you could conceivably say, I don't see why you would want to use Twitch, for example. You can do exactly what Twitch does on Amazon, or not, that you can do exactly what Twitch does on YouTube, for example. But Twitch is that tiny bit better for that specific community. And what are the and then thinking about, well, what are the jumping off points where you can't, maybe it's not realistic to have the lowercase r revolution for, you know, 1.52 billion people, but where can you pick them off? And then how do you guard against, you know, what sort of financial engineering or what sort of business model do you have that insulates you against effectively being bought out by one of the major platforms? Because that's what we don't want to happen, right?
Yeah, I think there's a really important sort of separate part to it, which I think would have been the most beneficial thing for Twitter as well, is that design applies to organizations and structures as well. And so what you're saying, Dan, about the things that would prevent a product from being acquired and purchased, those are the structural design of a technology company. There's very little discussion other than Valve is amazing because they have a money faucet, that in terms of their organizational structure, they are permitted to do incredible things. But like understanding how to create an organization that is sort of inured to the possibility of being acquired or being used sort of cynically is a challenge that mostly goes unaddressed within the technology community. People make companies, but they don't think about, to my knowledge, they don't think too much about how they guarantee that the company stays what it is.
Well, this is that's the traditional Fred Turner model, right? So that's your collision of, you know, utopian libertarianism with gobs of VC money and you know, people like In-Q-Tel flying in.
But it's also funny that you mentioned revolution. There's some friends of mine from a sort of a chaotic workers collective in New Zealand have been working for several years on a decision-making platform called Lumio that has been given free to a number of sort of dissident collectives around the world, and it's being used as a way to sort of do group deliberation and not unison, just consensus agreement as a way of sort of negotiating and renegotiating things. And I think, yeah, like the specific details of how conversations are presented and the way that discussions are kind of crafted and kept afloat is one of the sort of devils in the details aspects of what would set apart a Facebook, a Patagonia Facebook from a Facebook. If anybody's ever tried to sustain interesting conversation with people making good points and referring back to each other, Facebook does really poorly with that. You know, I have a number of really interesting contacts in various spaces in business around the world, and when we try to carry on a good conversation, it just feels continually cramped. And I can't help but think that the sort of the material affordances of the platform are at least as significant as the interminable sort of pop-up of ads and irrelevant sort of materials in the flow of the discussion to stifling it and making it so that it doesn't seem like it's going to be of high value.
So I'm looking at the thing that Kevin posted, and I'm pretty sure that I disagree with it. So this is an MIT paper that is about, and I think it illustrates a difference in thinking about top-down, large-scale social networking and bottom-up, group-centered or community-centered social networking and meeting community needs. Because there's a few points in there like saying Reddit doesn't work because per thread moderation doesn't work. But I feel like there are examples of well-moderated subreddit communities that are entirely dependent upon the people who have, to Brandon's point, set the social norms and behaviors of that community and then consistently enforce them. You know, thinking about Mastodon as well, there's 2 or 3 Mastodons that I was really into at the time. I think maybe 2 or 3 years ago now. And I'm wondering out loud, maybe it's not a big deal to try to enforce consistent moderation across an entire world-spanning social network, whether federated or not right now. Maybe it's actually okay to say, here is a specific community, you know what it's like in this community, and you can choose whether you want to be in here or not. And you can choose whether you want to federate with that, or whether you want to go into basically the shitty part of town where you know there are shitty people. I think, you know, that this is a very high level argument, because if your community is sufficiently porous, then you need to deal with brigading, you need to deal with people coming into your town. But at the least then, I feel like in the same way that there are amazing Facebook groups, communities that are run well by the moderators and have set a tone, and that they do, per user, I'm sure many per user, I'm sure many people on this call may be members of small group social networks or mailing lists or Slacks or whatever, where it's essentially invite or referral only. It's like, I know someone, I want to refer them to this, you can trust me, I vouch for them, and then that's how we grow. We grow slowly as opposed to growing really quickly. So I do wonder if that's part of the Fred Turner counterculture. Oh, everyone is the same. Everyone will want the same thing. We can all come into the same place. Maybe as a species, we're just not ready for that yet. And maybe we just have to accept that we don't yet have the intra-species tolerance yet. And our enlightenment is not sufficiently distributed for this to work as well as we would like right now. And then maybe we have to move more slowly towards it.
If I could jump in there, well, first off, what I'm posting isn't necessarily the way I think.
Yeah.
And like at my last think tank, like we publish stuff in favor of this decentralized web stuff. But I also worry that it falls into the trap of the sort of white male cyber libertarian vision of the future that we were talking about earlier. And that like, and the thing that brought it to a head for me is there was a conference about decentralized web technology in San Francisco put on by the head of the Internet Archive, who's a great guy. And this is like building on this sort of community of like, we want like built for the people, like bottom up, not controllable technology. And then you had Tristan Harris from the Center for Humane Technology coming in and disrupting that whole narrative and basically saying, you can't disclaim responsibility for this technology. And if you have all these different things all over that no one can control, like you're going to have all the same problems that you have with the big networks. What's your answer to that? And you don't have one because y'all are a bunch of cyber libertarians who don't want anything to be controllable. And so like, there's a really profound, like fundamental, like what is the vision of the future where we can both have that sort of decentralized, bottom up, not corporate controlled freedom, and also freedom from government overreaction or I haven't had enough coffee, but you know what I mean, versus like also a system where we can control for the most unpleasant aspects of society in a way that is respectful to all communities. And like, I'm not going to even pretend to have the answers there, but there's some really, really hard to resolve tensions there.
There's a side conversation going on. Andrew had brought up Metafilter, which I have always used as one of the best examples of a small world community moderated, very high touch community moderated online community. And what's interesting is that they've just had this conversation that came up this week where two highly motivated actors have effectively been abusing Twitter Metafilter users for the past few years, and they're doing it by logging in and then going screenshotting and essentially doxing. And one of the reasons this is really effective is that people have a sustained and persistent identity on Metafilter over the last 10, 15 years or so, right? So there are people on Metafilter who are now saying the mods on Metafilter owe us a duty of care to keep us users safe, which now includes policing activity on another social network, which is referencing activity on Metafilter. And one of the issues to do with that is because you have 10 to 15 years worth of posts, and you've got the original Metafilter stuff saying, well, one of the incredibly valuable things about Metafilter is the integrity and the sanctity of the archive. It is a body of human knowledge. We don't want to start memory holing specific threads of it and deleting an entire user's history. It's also incredibly technically complicated for them to do. But you've got people, and in this case, you have trans people who are saying, this abuse is intolerable. I want to be able to delete my account. And people starting to propose technical solutions, which I don't agree with, which my instinct is to not agree with, and say, maybe long-term persistent identity on a site like Metafilter, especially one where you have a persistent identity where you can ask questions and you can be de-anonymized, for example, maybe that's not a good thing. Maybe having the entire thing open isn't a good thing anymore in a way that we thought it was, just like with Twitter. When Twitter started, it was like, oh, I'm just sharing what I had for breakfast with my friends. Where could the harm be? It's just, you know, I have an entirely public profile because everyone, I literally know everyone on this platform right now, all the way through to 15 years later. So I think bringing that back to Julian's point about what's the design fiction for this, you know, what's the 15, 20 years later if we're successful and this spreads and this is a multi-million or billion user platform, right? What are we missing, and are there things that we can consider right from the beginning in terms of, you know, things like fire breaks or you know, to I think Tom's point, you know, there are some things that we know that are pretty inherent about human nature. How do we think about those instead of just being too, we want to be optimistic but not blind, right?
Yes, absolutely. Which is, you know, the obvious answer, but that sentiment. But the one thing that I really want, like zeroing in on, I'm not saying that we necessarily need to carry on the discussion in this direction, is like what kind of practices could be made kind of like hygienic, as opposed to like you know, you don't get dessert if you don't eat your vegetables, kind of punitive, in the just a hygienic kind of part of the ritual of, like, you know, a bunch of people sitting around tables like, wouldn't it be cool if we did this? You know, like, you know, coming up with like, wouldn't it be cool if we had a platform we could call it Twitter, you know? And then people sort of tweet to each other, and going through that, and that level of like, why is there not the thing of like, what does this look like when we have a billion users? You know, like essentially design fiction as a kind of routine aspect of our, you know, kind of imagining spectacular gyrating success, because we all know, you know, success comes with like lots of headaches. I'm sure, you know, there's no one at Twitter is like having a good day today. You know, like, what are going to be our bad days? It's just curious to me that we don't do that. Sorry, go on, Scott, or whoever was talking. Kevin.
I was just going to add, I haven't kept up with it, so I don't know where it's at these days, but I mean, it's kind of a while ago, 6 or more years back, maybe more. Did a project with Pivotal Labs, and it was when I first was learning what Agile is, and didn't realize at the time how different their approach was till later in terms of test-driven development. So they do what you're describing, not so big of consideration, but they essentially are like, what could go wrong, and then how do we anticipate that in whatever we build? So there's a test they create that they then have to pass. And I'm assuming they still do that because it made the code that much more easy and robust for future changes. Any Agile firm I've ever worked with since then has not done that step, and therefore are a pain in the ass to make changes. It's despite them saying they're Agile. I'm like, you're like just mini microcast waterfalls. And so to me, I'm like, it'd be interesting to share what you're saying with some of the folks at Pivotal Labs, because I could imagine they would be interested in that in the, I think it's called the inception process, where you're doing the original user story writing phase, and essentially do these kinds of scenarios when you're doing, you know, user can print, and you're like, what if 2 million people are printing this thing? Like, do we want that? Is that a thing we should, like, maybe not in the first round or whatever? I think there's that. And then the other thing I shared was the ethical OS toolkit from Institute for the Future. I don't know that I don't know how well Institute for the Future is like evangelizing on their own behalf, but I ran into this at SwissNext here in SF. It was shared by some researchers at Institute for the Future, but it's essentially trying to do what you're saying. Like, install these kinds of questions in the early conception of any technology, like, hey, consider the ethical implications or unintended consequences of what you're about to build. Now, why that's not taking is, I think, a bigger, or for me, kind of the question. Like, the methods of doing it are there, but culturally, is it not conducive to the business model? Does it somehow seem counter to the pace of agile, which I'm assuming you would say no, because it ultimately saves you time later, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm wondering if people are familiar with those things, and then why it's not taking.
I mean, I'm familiar with it.
Yeah.
I'm familiar with it. I've talked to the people who designed it, and they're trying to do some updates around it. I think there are a lot of challenges that aren't tied to not wanting to do it, but more around, and actually a good example is NeurIPS, which is one of the big AI conferences. They've now started requiring, you need a social impact like paragraph or two about ways this might be used good or bad. But it's like, these are AI, computer scientist researchers. They don't have frameworks for actually thinking that through.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't just say, like, is it ethical or not, or is it going to have negative externalities or not? Like,
right.
You actually need a framework. Like, just saying ethical doesn't help. Like, which ethics? What kind of ethics? Mm-hmm. Like, what are you valuing? How do you make those decisions? Like, there just aren't actually schematic enough approaches that you could hand to an engineer that they could apply in their thinking.
Yeah,
and then that doesn't also answer the question of, okay, we've identified a potential problem. Is it up to us to make the trade-off of, like, user or societal value versus that problem? Is that a problem for policymakers? Is that a problem for some other aspect of society? Or are we responsible for every single possible negative use of what we're building, and we need to somehow mitigate every possible risk of every possible bad thing? Like, where do you draw that line? There's no real schematic structures for making those decisions either. And so it's a big, hairy problem, and we don't have, like, anything close to the crispness that, like, a design team or an engineering team actually needs to make those kinds of decisions. So but we're thinking about, like, we are actively thinking about, like, how do we do that? And it's really hard. And the like, product teams are really frustrated when we're just like, do better at that.
So I spent 3 years on the IEEE ethics in autonomous systems committee, and that committee, with people who are way more learned in the world of ethics than I am, we spent 3 years talking this through. I'm posting a link in the chat to the ethical standards that IEEE propagated as a result of that work, and it's I think it's a great place to start. So I mean, a lot to say about it, but, like, your point is really a well taken point. You just say ethics to people, and it's like, hello, what do you
even have, like, principle sets? Like, at this point, there are dozens of, like, AI principle sets that are sort of based on human rights or based on some sort of ethical approach, but they're all very high level about, like, respecting privacy and autonomy and this and that. But, like, okay, how do you actually operationalize that into a, like, product design framework? And it's like, all that translation work, that's what I think the whole community is trying to figure out how to do now. Is, like, how do we actually take those principles into, like, reliable practice? And no one has good answers to that. And part of the challenge is, frankly, the companies are the ones that actually understand how their stuff works, while people outside only know what their concerns are, and trying to figure out how to meet in the middle and actually have something that meets the technical and business reality and also addresses these sometimes vaguely stated concerns, like, is a big project that's going to take a while.
Yeah, I think
that's what my job is. That's what I'm trying to work on.
That's laudable. One of the things thinking about a framework that has been really interesting and constructive for me in my career is obliging people to produce artifacts that give them information about what is the consequence of their product. So a million years ago, I built several of the bundle apps for Dell. The weather app and whatever else that they put on their screens that you uninstall as soon as you get the computers. But millions of people don't. Like at the time they were selling like 2 million PCs a month, and so I back of the envelope just was thinking about, if I increased the CPU usage of that thing by 1%, then that was so many terawatts of battery power that was being drained. If I tied up 0.1% of their user base in customer support, that was several people's full-time jobs just fielding sort of technical complaints about the one thing that I did. Working on websites now for large companies that get sort of 10 million hits a month, or no, 10 million hits a day at sometimes, and saying like, look, if we reduce this by that much, then we're taking 3.5 years of wait time out of internet downloads, and it's not even that those things are customer concerns. There would be reasonable actual sort of corporate concerns, but nobody has had the ability or opportunity to even reason about those consequences without doing that basic expansion and having those, like I said, like these artifacts, these ideas of what it is that is being affected by even 0.1% of 10 million people is just a lot of people. And if you do that, if there's any quantity related to something that they're burning or they're using or they're paying, then that is a valuable thing for people to understand they can make a dent in.
So I have a question to sort of bring it back to design fiction and science fiction, which is, I know that there's a lot of, not a lot, but a community of consultants like Julian who do design fiction for corporate clients to think about the future, often thinking about the positive, like what's the future of beverages or whatever. And we've been talking about how can we focus that more on the negative. But I'm curious about like the information flow in the other direction. Instead of like bespoke design fiction applied to a company, where do we see, or do we see efforts to sort of mine existing science fiction, like the corpus of sci-fi, for actionable or insightful ideas about the positive or negative externalities of new technologies? Like, for example, I know that there was this big European Space Agency study from 10 or 20 years ago where they did a survey of like, what kind of space technologies have we seen in science fiction as a way to help them ideate. But I don't see much work like that, like actually trying to derive insight from the fiction as opposed to creating fiction to create insight. And I'm wondering if people are aware of work on those models. Because like, for example, like there was a lot of really interesting tech critique in Neil Stephenson's new novel. But like, I don't see anyone doing the work of deriving that and handing it to Facebook, for example. Although hopefully some of those ideas are getting through because there are a lot of nerds at companies like Facebook who read those books. But like, I don't see systemic work to derive insight from the work that science fiction writers are doing in their fiction, in the market of science fiction. I'm wondering if others see much work in that regard.
Kevin, Chris Noessel, and I can't remember the name of his co-author, but they've got a fantastic book on this. I think it's called Make It So. It's interaction pattern design. You're probably aware of it. I mean, I would love to see more like that. I mean, that was pretty much the genesis or one of the thoughts behind a talk that I did earlier this year about how uncritically examined science fiction can lead to badly implemented design, because science fiction is more or less intended to tell an optimistic story, right? The tools work unless the story says that they don't have to, or you get a particular view from there. But it was funny for you to bring up Neil Stephenson, because I like to joke that Snow Crash is probably responsible for a lot of things that I don't like about the world that we live in right now, because people thought it would be cool to live in Snow Crash. Turns out I don't think so much.
Sorry, Kevin, you're muted.
Well, back on the cyber libertarian tip, it is funny how many people don't seem to recognize that Snow Crash was a satire, like, and sort of an extrapolation of what the Reagan 80s were going to create in the future. That people were like, yeah, burp claves, let's do that. But
I think maybe it's a really good question. I think if you're asking like, are there kind of a more operationalizing that possible relationship between science fiction and the work that goes on in whatever science fact, I'm not aware of like a some kind of routinized practice for that. I know that there, here and there, there'll be almost like fan level sort of extrapolations, but sort of few and far between. But I think that it does happen in particular contexts, especially more, I guess, less public arenas. But my own personal first exposure to that possible relationship was when I was working at the HIT lab at University of Washington. So like the first version of virtual reality, and was like handed or told to go get a copy of Neuromancer in order to understand what like all the kind of like all the other kind of my colleagues in the lab, who were all grad students, were talking about, and the language that they were using and the idioms that they were using to describe it. And that became a kind of sort of seminal, pivotal moment for me to realize that, oh wait, there is very porous boundaries. I think part of it is also maybe that it happens. It's just not clearly articulated. So we might see Kevin, like probably like many other people in the industry, there's a certain fascination with science fiction at a number of levels. So you watch Blade Runner, and you're kind of like, oh, this sort of reminds me of things that I'm working on, or I can see a world like this based on things that I either am doing or want to do, or I get inspired to do it. But it's oftentimes I think it's indirect. The other way is when it's commissions from clients where you do science fiction in order as part of that, as a component of that work. So might reach out as part of you're just speaking of the Near Future Laboratory, part of our network, and ask someone who is a science fiction writer, like, hey, could you write us a short story? Here's the brief, here's the basic idea. If you could have something in whatever 45 days, that'd be great. Just a little short story. So that often happens as a way of kind of inspiring or providing stimulus material for a broader set of questions.
Well, I just posted what is sort of an amateur effort to mine a bunch of tech ideas from sci-fi in a systemic way. It's like GeoCities level website run by an individual. But like, I love the idea and I love the enthusiasm that the guy has shown by maintaining this site as his side gig for like, a very long time. But it's called Technovelgy. It's fun to peruse. But I'd love to see something that is like that, but like more substantial and professionalized. All that.
Yeah, there's also that what was that kind of little, I don't even know if it's a documentary that William Shatner hosted. I forget the name of it. It was basically, he was saying like everything in the world was invented by Star Trek or by me or something. He was playing on a campy. And they actually go through and look at some of our favorite little props and prototypes in Star Trek and saying, ooh, this became this. The start Motorola Star Trek is the canonical example, but it gets quite exhausting. It's very entertaining just because it's William Shatner being slightly campy. But that's just sort of like an isolated one. But also I think I often refer people to it if they're trying to understand, like, I don't get it. How is science fiction related to science fact? Like, one is true and one isn't. It's like, well, watch this, and explains the kind of like this sort of leaky flows back and forth between the real world and the fictional world, which is very porous. And then the his name's escaping me. Did lab coats in Hollywood.
Oh yeah, Kirby.
Kirby, yeah, David Kirby. So it's sort of like it's not a completely thoroughgoing theme through his work, but he is interested in kind of like how entertainment and the real world kind of like a lot of crosstalk. So he did stuff, so he did science fiction with the technical consultants, and then he did some work on our understanding of like kind of the judicial process as informed by like Law and Order, and kind of went in this other particular direction.
So this reminds me that next week I want to hear all about 100 Pixel if I can join. Anyway, I'm sorry if I talked too much for a newbie on this call, but it's been really nice.
No, please, Kevin. I'm glad you joined. Welcome. And it's all about the conversations, discussions, and very new perspective. So thank you for joining. Yeah, we're gonna call it. Is that it? Hey, Taylor. Cool. All right, that was a good one. I'm totally jazzed about it. I'm like telling the gang in Slack. I'm like, you guys have to listen to this one. It's a good one. Cool. All right, you guys.
All right.
Take care.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Julian.
Bye, Manzi.
Bye.
Bye, David. Bye, David.